Everybody, welcome to the fourth of the webinars hosted by the Institute for Energy Transition, Curtin's Institute for Energy Transition. I'm standing in for Peter, who sadly isn't able to make today's session, but I know she will be listening to the recording. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I would like to acknowledge that this meeting is being held on lands of the First Nations, in my case, Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Tavis Potts. Tavis, I'm reading the bio I was given, is Dean for Sustainability, Chair in Environmental Governance and Sustainable Development, and Coordinator of the Just Transition Lab at the University of Aberdeen. So he's enjoying a balmy summer's day. Tavis is a multidisciplinary social scientist interested in the political economy of sustainability and how societies and institutions implement more sustainable outcomes. A few other little pointers about Tavis: originally from New South Wales and was inspired to go and live in Aberdeen, and has been there since, sort of around 2006, being in Scotland. And apparently, an interesting fact, he's a massive geek and gamer and is exploring research around gaming and sustainability. So sounds pretty exciting stuff. So with no further ado, Tavis, you're going to talk to us on measuring progress towards just transition. Thank you.
Thanks, Fran. I'll just get my screen shared. Hello to everybody. It's lovely to meet you. Hello from the North Sea and Aberdeen in Scotland. It's a heat wave today. It's at 24, it says in the office, and maybe get up to 25 today outside. So that's pretty hot for northern Scotland. So we're looking forward to get out and enjoy that. Yeah, originally from the central coast of New South Wales. So it's been a journey coming over here, and I've enjoyed working in Scotland for the past 20 years, and probably for the next 20 years, I'd say. So I'll just share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see that okay. Good. I can't see any of your beautiful faces, so I'm just sort of talking to Fran here, sort of one-to-one, but assuming there's a virtual room full of people. So I just want to take you through initially just some of the background to the research we've been doing here and some of the background to Aberdeen, and then there's a lot in this work, so we'll just give you a whistle-stop tour of the work that we're doing around measuring a just transition in Aberdeen, a global energy city. So this is the team. We collectively form what's called the Just Transitions Lab. So originally I was the interim director of the Centre for Energy Transition, set up the Centre for Energy Transition here at Aberdeen in 2020. And had a lot of discussions on the formative aspects of your institute as well in Curtin, and really always pleased to collaborate and discuss and chat with you on both sides of the world about the shape and nature of energy transition. And in 2022, I stepped away from that role and started what's called the Just Transitions Lab. We are very much an interdisciplinary research center, which is focusing on just transition as a process of change, looking at things like communities, policy, health, employment, participation, and interactions with technology. So we're a very diverse team cutting across geography, geology, labor market economics, law, sociology, and engineering. So we do a lot of work. This is one of our many projects that we have on at the moment. And again, we're really happy to sort of keep the discussion going with you. Also, we'll be out hopefully we'll definitely be out to Curtin in November for the Petrocultures Conference. So look forward to meeting some of you face to face at that event on the 11th of November. So this particular study, interestingly, and we'll come back to this in discussion, this study was funded by Uplift, who are a major non-government group here in the UK. I'm just going to minimize my screen so I can see my slides. And this was a relatively small study, but it aimed to really fill a gap of how do we get our heads around what just transition means for Aberdeen, which is a an oil and gas capital, now rebranding itself as an energy city, and we'll talk about that. And there's two parts to this study. The first sort of 6 months of this 12-month study was to do a systematic review of the history of oil and gas in Aberdeen. How has oil and gas shaped the region? We also looked at the various conflicting and different and overlapping visions for a just transition. We examined over 4,000 different sources and through a systematic process, whittled it down to 170 key sources from media, local authorities, the industry. And really, we're sort of understanding the story here. How has oil and gas shaped the city, both the positive and the negative sides of it? And it also gave us some sense of how we're going to move forward in measuring a just transition. This was coupled with a series of very wide and broad stakeholder workshops engaging groups who, both the traditional groups engage in energy, energy companies, for example, but also groups such as the third sector and the charity sector, who aren't usually involved in discussions about the nature of the future of the city from an energy transition perspective. The second part was then to develop a set of indicators from the themes we developed in the workshops and use evidence and data analysis and participatory research to map out these indicators. It really fills a major gap in Scotland, where we have a lot of policy progress, attention and interest on a just transition. But we haven't really established yet a way of how we actually measure that in practice, whether it's in a place-based context or a national context. So we're trying to fill that gap. A little bit of a history of Aberdeen and just some context. I'll go through pretty quickly on this because we've got quite a few slides. Aberdeen has been through many changes. It's been through many transitions over hundreds of years. Historically, Aberdeen was a fishing industry stretching back at least 800 years back into the past. In fact, the oldest port in the UK is Aberdeen Harbour, continually operating port, is 850 years old. We have a history of manufacturing, of mills, of paper milling, of textiles. In fact, an interesting fact I discovered recently was a lot of the jackets and uniforms for the American Civil War for the Confederate Army were supplied by the mills of Aberdeen. So very interesting historical industrial fact there for the city. And then everything changed in 1969 with the discovery of oil in the North Sea. Aberdeen became a hub for oil and gas development. It became a base for subsea and developing expertise in subsea engineering in very challenging ocean environments. And this was great for 30 years. Production of oil and gas peaked in about 2000, 1999, 2000, late 1990s. And really then the history of Aberdeen through that period has been one that's been in lockstep with the oil price and the rise and fall of that. And there have been several major slumps. One of the major slumps in the history of Aberdeen, which caused catastrophic economic conditions, was in 2014. And the fallout for that is still felt in the city. And then in recent years, with lockdown, there was another slump in the oil industry. And then we see this attempt at reinvigoration of the city. We have the Scottish government, the UK government setting the world's first legally binding net zero targets, 2050 for the UK. And of course, Scotland, always trying to be one better than the UK, had to go 2045. That's caused its own problems, including a major change in government recently. And we'll come back to that in the discussions. We see the city trying to grasp with a net zero vision of what it stands for. There are a range of commercial developments. And even a few weeks ago in the change of government, the North Sea in Aberdeen has been at the centre of political debates. And this is all very much setting in the context of, we've got some various historical pictures here, Aberdeen today as a port, Aberdeen as a fishing port, Aberdeen potentially as a future, but all set against the context of a declining oil and gas resource, which will decline by over 95% up to 2050. And very, very simple terms, what are some of the benefits and what are some of the impacts of the industry here in Aberdeen? Well, of course, it fueled the local economy over 30, 40 years. A couple of generations of people have worked in the oil industry and the gas industry here in Aberdeen. A lot of people moved into the city. Aberdeen has a much more cosmopolitan and international seen a much more diverse ethnicity in Aberdeen than it would have had without the oil. We have a lot of people from all around the world who live in Aberdeen who've moved here because of the oil and gas. Obviously, employment was huge. It was very lucrative jobs here, really good paying jobs. There was some investments in local transport and infrastructure, and Aberdeen became known as an international centre for excellence, and still is known as a centre for international excellence in things such as subsea engineering. What are some of the impacts we noticed? Well, a lot of the introduction of the oil really sucked the life out of a lot of the regional industries. So we saw people shifting from agriculture, fishing, textiles, paper into the oil and gas. That was better paid. There were better jobs. It was a booming industry. So it accelerated the decline of many traditional or existing industries. It was seen as a wealthy place. So therefore, some of the regional assistance from UK level government was removed because of the tax receipts flowing through Aberdeen City. There were enormous pressures on housing. And local authorities to accommodate a hugely growing population. We just couldn't build houses quick enough, and house prices have massively increased, boom times over the time, which was great if you're working in oil and gas, but terrible if you weren't. The other 2/3 of the employment base not working in oil and gas. And really, Aberdeen has and still is arguably a one-horse town economically. It was vulnerable to oil price slumps, and that multiple times has caused serious declines to the local economy. And I'll just let you sort of absorb some of these quotes here. I'll just keep moving on just because of time, but the left is sort of the positive and right is some of the negative impacts. And we cover all this in our report. So I have a link to the report and can send you both the copies of the reports, which have some fantastic quotes through the history of the city. You see the one of the quote here from the 1980. It has an air of self-confidence. It was called Houston in the UK. It was a confident city, has self-assurance about it. But it also brought hugely rocketing prices. So if you're dining out, it became a very expensive luxury, except for those if in industry are working on expense accounts. And then when the downturn happened, that the news reported that the oil boom was over, that we're going back to fishing and farming. Cars were seen saying, "Please, God, give us another chance. We promise we're not to throw it away." And then a recent quote here from a paper, the stories of people driving to collect food parcels in sports cars and Ferraris, and unemployed workers with homes far too big to sell. The city has become a prism to understand the long-term effects of the fossil economy and its volatility, but also the springboard, the energy transition for a nascent renewable sector. So some really interesting quotes that illustrate the fortunes and the misfortunes of the city that has been connected to oil for a very, very long time. And so through our process of going through the strategic review and working with a diverse array of stakeholders over a number of workshops, we really distilled how are you going to start measuring a just transition. And there are many definitions of a just transition. I'm not going to go into those definitions today, but we've heard that it can be from not leaving anyone behind, ensuring that the impacts of the transition don't just fall on those who have the least ability to pay, and that the benefits are spread evenly across the population and those participating in the transition. And we've split it into 4 areas based on our discussions with stakeholders. And this is a much more, I think, a holistic vision of a just transition, as opposed to the traditional version of one just solely focused on jobs. And in Aberdeen, it's been very much focused on how do we deal with declining oil sector and the jobs, and how do we create new jobs. That's fundamentally important. And that's why it's one of our 4 segments: employment, earnings, and skills. But we see the transition as a holistic social concept that is very much about represents justice, and that should also be addressing factors, historical justice issues such as housing and poverty and well-being in communities. That participation is incredibly important in the transition, particularly around hard to decarbonize areas such as homes, heating or cooling, Transport and behavior change, these are critical areas to decarbonize, and they require participation and behavior change. And community empowerment and revitalization is a critical pillar of the transition as well. Getting communities involved and actually changing the nature of the energy system to one that is at least partially decentralized and uses things such as community energy, community access, and community green space. And collectively, these form, according to our stakeholder groups and our discussions, how we will measure the transition. So I'm just going to pick out one or two indicators. We had over 55 indicators in the report, collectively painting the picture of a transition in Aberdeen. We'll just pick one or two from each section. This is the list of the groups of indicators. Often these had multiple measurements in them. So we looked at things such as employment, skills and jobs. We looked at housing, fuel, poverty, health, a significant issue. And these will come more apparent as we go through some of the indicators, why it's important to include them in a just transition analysis. Participation is important. We often talk about participation as a part of the energy transition, yet it's a very difficult area. This is one of the hardest areas to measure and get data on. How we do that, how we embed meaningful deliberative processes, and community ownership, the basket of indicators there. So things such as travel, adaptation, community energy, and ownership of assets. It's a very big issue in Scotland as well. Land and land ownership is a huge issue here. So just on the first basket on employment and skills, so looking at total employment in the northeast of Scotland, in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire, you can see here in 2013, which was the time of the first major downturn, that there's been a shift in employment. In fact, employment in the region has been on a slow and steady long-term decline. From this high point, you can see here this orange line here. Sorry, the blue line here is Aberdeen, and the orange line here is Aberdeen City. This is Aberdeenshire up above, and there's this drop here in employment and this long, slow, steady decline in employment. After we published the report, we noticed a very interesting paper that came out called The State of Cities in the UK, and it looked at 74 major cities and towns across the UK, a range of different economic indicators. And we noticed, quite shockingly, that Aberdeen, in terms of new job creation, was last. It was 74th on the list. And this really shows that how there is a substantial, sustained and long-term decline in the energy sector. There are still many jobs. It's still the dominant sector, but it's certainly not the heydays of the late 90s and the 2000s. There is a long-term structural decline in jobs. And if we have a look at some of the figures here, I'll just flick through these. So this is oil and gas direct employment. Just look at northeast Scotland. We've got Aberdeen City and Shire here in Scotland and Great Britain. But you can see here that there's been about almost a third drop in direct employment since 2015 to 2021, and a continued slow drop in that in northeast Scotland, and that's been replicated as well over Scotland and Great Britain, but most of the jobs are in northeast Scotland. If you look at energy sector employment, so this has been cushioned slightly because we've seen an increase now in renewable energy jobs, but not enough to stop the slow and long-term decline. So there are overall another sort of 9,000 jobs, 10,000 jobs in renewable energy in northeast Scotland. So if we look at 2021, there's about a difference of 9,000 jobs there. So from 41,000, but it's still a drop to 30,000 jobs. So we're still seeing this slow shift, this slow drop in decline in energy jobs. But this is as a nascent, growing renewables industry starting to take off in the region. I mentioned housing before. A lot of people moved into Aberdeen in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s as the oil industry grew. And we saw a huge rising in both housing development and social housing development, and a huge increase in housing prices, which was good for the property markets here in Aberdeen. Great if you could afford to buy into the housing market. Not so good if you were not working in the oil and gas industry. And we can see a sort of boom here from sort of 2010. We can see the red is the city of Aberdeen here, this increase. But something is interesting has been happening since the major decline in oil. There has been a slow and steady decline in the value of housing. You can see this continual drop from 2014 to 2023, despite all the other indicators for Scotland. So Scotland is the grey line, a slow increase in prices of housing, and a comparable city, the lovely city of Dundee, also having a slow and steady rise. But house prices have been falling and falling and falling as values have dropped, as people have moved away, as houses have been sold off because of the closure. So this is really affecting the housing market in Aberdeen. We have in 2023, we have a market which is about 57% owner occupied, but a growing increase in rental properties and in local authority and social housing. One area that's not often talked about in terms of Aberdeen is the social impacts and the well-being impacts, and we felt it was really important to bring these into the analysis. What in part this study does is bring together a lot of different indicators about the health of communities and the health of the city as a whole. Not just the traditional indicators such as employment or investment or company growth or skills, although we do include all of those in our fuller analysis, but it brings together a much more holistic understanding of the transition and what's happening in the city. So another interesting story here, and a sad story here, is about how there's been a growth and increase in the proportion of households in fuel poverty in northeast Scotland. So again, from sort of 2014, this is really seems to be the key year where things started to get worse and not really recovered. This growth in fuel poverty to where now the most recent estimates for the bracket up to 2019 and this will be extended even further with the cost of living crisis in the UK. A 25%, 27, just under 27% of houses, so just over a quarter of houses are suffering from fuel poverty in northeast Scotland, which is essentially defined as over a third of your household income is going into heating your home. We have terribly inefficient homes in the city, granite buildings, leaky, drafty homes that get very cold and damp across the UK as a whole, and Aberdeen is no exception. And yet fuel poverty in Scotland has been dropping consistently. It has been increasing consistently in Aberdeen. Now, part of this story is also because wages have been dropping. So the definition of fuel poverty is one about the proportion of your wage spent on heating. If wages have been dropping, then more people have been pushed into fuel poverty. We also have measures of extreme fuel poverty, which has also been growing in Aberdeen. And to corroborate some of those stories and those quotes about food parcels, well, this is a local food, the main food charity in Aberdeen called Seafine. And you can see here in a slow increase in the use of food parcels. And then, of course, when COVID hit and another slump in the industry happened and global demand for energy dropped, went absolutely through the roof, a 500% increase in distribution of food parcels. But yet still, this is going back up to those COVID levels now in recent years now, still a huge increase from the historical baseline of use of food parcels, where people in serious poverty or have lost jobs are relying on food banks in the city and growing. And this just kind of keeps telling the story that Aberdeen is a very divided city. It is number 2 on the Gini coefficient in the UK, which is the distribution of wealth. We have groups of very, very wealthy areas. So the West End here of Aberdeen in the blue, but areas of also high marginalization and high poverty. And this has been recognized in recent policy documents such as the Climate Emergency Skills Action Plan of the Scottish Government, where really, and this is again a key aspect of the justice in the just transition, that the new jobs associated with net zero are probably skewed towards certain socioeconomic groups, very diplomatic language there by the Scottish government, skewed towards certain socioeconomic groups, i.e. the incumbents in the oil and gas industry, and those in lower skilled, low income or unstable employment, which has grown in Aberdeen. They're less likely to actually be able to take advantage of the energy transition opportunities. And this is the story we are seeing repeated time and again in the city and its planning around future energy and the energy transition, most notably the major social conflict in this area around St. Fittick's Park and the energy transition zone. I'll just keep moving quite quickly through these. I can't see the tops of my slides here because of the Zoom bar here, but we also tried to measure democratic participation. Now, this is a really hard area to measure, especially when we're looking for primary data, but it's increasingly important. It's a part of the core policy aspect of a just transition where people should be engaged in participatory justice or procedural justice, where we have a huge upsurge in the city of Aberdeen around things like climate assemblies, both nationally and in the northeast of Scotland. Climate assemblies are becoming very popular, but they tend to happen in a policy vacuum. So we want to gather at least some data about trying to assess, are people involved in the transition and having their say? And again, overall, you see this Aberdeen effect. Do you trust decisions in local government and to local decision makers? Or Aberdeen, there was slightly lower than, say, the national average here of 63%. Aberdeen was about 55%. I'll just open some of these up. The story here, can I influence decisions with local government? And we see here again in Aberdeen, there's this decrease in trust about making local decisions, which bottomed out around 2019, and overall in Aberdeenshire and in Scotland wasn't as steep, but there was this steep decline in trust here, sort of from 2015 down to 2019. It could be a whole range of reasons here. It could be the Brexit outcome. It could have been the oil price shocks, the decline of jobs. A next thing to ask people was, well, do you agree that your council is good at listening? Is your local authority, is the closest form of government, is it good at listening to you? And the Scotland average, well, it's declined slightly over time and then increased. With Aberdeen, we see this peak in 2019 and this slow decline of trust in or agreement. Is my local council listening? So while all the others are upticking and more positive, there is a continual decline in Aberdeen. And the last one, well, if you don't really trust your decision makers and if you don't think they're very good at listening, then naturally you would expect that you want greater involvement in planning and decisions. Climate assemblies are one reflection of this trend. And of course, here we see this substantive uptick in the orange line representing Aberdeen here. And we're seeing this uptick in Scotland, in Aberdeenshire, a slight decrease in Aberdeenshire, but Aberdeen a very strong uplift here in wanting greater involvement. People want to be involved in the decisions of the energy transition. Communities want to be involved. They don't want the decisions solely to be made by the incumbent energy sector. They want a much more diverse platform for decision making. And that's something we're working very hard in the lab to constantly promote and deliver. Community energy is another big part of it here. There's some stats here from Aberdeen, parts of Aberdeen and the Shire. So the Shire, I should point out, is a much larger rural area. Aberdeen local authority is the city. Aberdeen Shire is a very large rural area. What we're seeing here, these aren't just renewable energy assets. These are community assets. So this could be buildings, or it could be land, or it could be renewable energy installations, things that are owned by communities. And what we see is a difference in the city. There's not many things owned by communities. Now that could be because it's small, it's a city. And Aberdeenshire East and West are very large open rural areas. And there are definitely more in terms of hectares and scale and in number, assets owned, and actually more community groups, which is quite interesting. But it doesn't tell the full story, because if we look at other cities around Scotland, Aberdeen relatively low. It's the second lowest in terms of owning assets, community-owned assets and community groups. Where if you look at Glasgow, 5 times the number of community assets that are owned, 4 times the amount of community groups. Places like Stirling, Inverness, all have much higher, either in volume and size or in numbers of assets and groups. So something different is happening in Glasgow and Inverness and Stirling and Edinburgh than in Aberdeen. We don't know the answer to why that is. Could be partially because of the culture of the city, of being a global energy city, a city full of global energy companies relying on one sector. There's not as large a civil society movement for community ownership here. And that's something we want to keep pressing and exploring some more. And actually something we think is changing in the city. I'm happy to explore that point a bit more. And again, we see, if we look at the growth sectors in the Northeast, the dominant sector has and still is energy. It takes up 30,000 of the jobs, and 30% of the total employment is still in energy. It's still the biggest game in town. It's still a key part of what the future for Aberdeen is going to be and what it's going to look like. But there are other sectors on the horizon, such as food and drink. Again, almost going back historically to what Aberdeen was in the past, on a fishing industry, whiskey, another big export for the region as well, financial and business services, tourism, creative industries and life sciences are both very small but growing industries. So part of the answer to Aberdeen's transition is not staying as solely an energy city. That's a controversial statement, actually, giving the weight of industries that are here, but it's not going to be the only part of the story. We have to diversify the economy, and that is recognized across the board. One of my final indicators here, this one is a shocker, actually. We weren't aware of this trend, but if we look at empty high streets, empty high streets were a problem during COVID, during lockdown, and we look at here, this is the retail market vacancy rates. So the red line is Aberdeen. Aberdeen has, by a significant margin, the highest level of empty shops and retail streets in the country. And it's growing and growing and growing and growing. Yet we see places like Dundee shrinking. Its retail market vacancy is lower and lower, and it's dropped significantly. Dundee is re-establishing itself. It is redesigning itself as a city of design. It has the V&A Museum. It has got design and craft industries. It's got the computer gaming industry there. It is really reforming itself. Aberdeen seems to be going backwards, and it is losing retail market. And if you walk around Aberdeen, there are many, many closed shops, closed businesses. In the West End, you see site after site of formerly consulting or law companies or consulting firms or legal firms shutting down. So this needs to be turned around. So it was just a real whistle-stop tour of some of the indicators. They collectively start to tell this story about this boom town, Aberdeen, its peak in oil, a lot of money coming through, and this shift now as oil is declining and the transition is growing, a big question mark about what the future is for the city. I'm not going to go through all of these recommendations, but we've been working really hard with engaging with the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament in this research. I can just go through one or two of these. So we want to continue to strengthen regional assemblies in the city. We're getting a lot of growth in citizen discussion. We're really pushing hard over the next 12 months for a regional assembly, because what Aberdeen does lack is this cohesive vision of what it wants to be for the future. And bringing everybody into that is a very challenging process, because the decision-making power has sat in the hands of the energy industry for a long time, and that's now a much more diverse, conflicting, and actually quite innovative space, an interesting space to work. So we want to increase that social dialogue and actually make it formally linked to policy. We also want to actually invest in reaching marginalized and underrepresented groups to have agency in the transition, not just the big global conferences on the future of the North Sea, but how does it affect those marginalized groups that are in fuel poverty, that are using fuel banks, that have to sell their house? Everyone has to have a stake in the future of the city. We want to keep retraining and developing new skills for energy transition jobs. Jobs is one of the key factors, and we have to ensure that there are jobs here for the sector going forward. They may or may not be in the energy sector. They may be, some of them will be in the booming offshore wind sector, but we're seeing a challenge around that they are actually short-term jobs in construction and maintenance, but not necessarily the long-term jobs in manufacturing of the offshore wind industry. We want to make sure, well, I was probably optimistic here, a cross-party, cross-nation energy strategy. I can come back to that. And we've had some major developments, which I can talk about in the question in terms of the new government here. We need to make sure we're getting data on participation, on classifications of green jobs, and cooperation on data sets around the workforce. And we need to really ensure that there is a smooth transition as the decline of the oil industry comes in over the next few decades, that there is a smooth transition to new economic opportunities. And a key part of that is the offshore energy skills passport, where at present it's really hard for workers to leave oil and gas and go into, say, renewable sector, because they have to retrain and pay to retrain. So there's a lot of work going on. It's over 2 years delayed for some reason. The offshore energy skills passport is one of the key tickets there, ensuring a smooth transition between energy sectors. So just to end off on some reflection points, we've had several transitions here. Transition isn't particularly new for the city. We've had transitions over hundreds of years. The modern economy of Aberdeen post-1970s has been very much tightly coupled to one sector, that of oil and gas. That's brought its benefits, it's also brought its impacts. There were clear winners and losers over the decades. The future is very uncertain for Aberdeen. Will the energy transition save us? There's a big question mark about how we approach that. If we turn to a just transition must be a holistic concept, not just focus solely on jobs, which are critical and one of the 4 pillars, but we also have to address the aspects around participation, health and well-being, and revitalization of communities. It's often talked about here in Aberdeen that we've had a global and very powerful energy sector here in the city for 4 decades. There have been billions of pounds come through the city, but most of that has gone to offshore companies. We have libraries shutting down, several public pools shutting down, a disintegration of community and civic infrastructure, and a lack of investment. We have not been able to capture the rent for public investment from oil and gas. Most of it has gone offshore. We have had the opposite approach than what say, the Norwegians have had, for example. Just transitions must address social justice issues alongside economic development to ensure that no one is left behind. And taking an integrated approach to transition actually opens the door for better policy discussions and interventions. It brings in discussions about co-benefits. It increases participation in the workforce. It spurs both social and economic innovation and a much more diversified economy for the city that once again can hopefully be confident and look forward and be a major player in the transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tavis. That was fantastic. Really, really enjoyed that, particularly since I used to live in Scotland until 2012. So very, very interesting. Wonderful to get such a deep insight into the transition a city gets. And I think it's very opposite to here in Australia as well, because if I look at Collie transitioning out of coal, I would see the same need for that multidiscipline, that pluralistic approach to transition, that it's social, it's political, as well as economic and environmental. I noticed that we've got a number of questions in the Q&A box. So let me just read a couple out if you want to just kick off and answer them. The first one that I'm reading is, how important is education in terms of smoothing the way for a just transition? Does the population have the skills and knowledge to take up new jobs, for example, offshore wind?
Yeah, one of the positive economic indicators for the region. So we do have a long-term decline in jobs in oil and gas, and a long-term decline, slight decline in overall employment. But one of the positive, I guess, positive economic stories is that Aberdeen has one of the highest highly skilled workforces in the country. So we have a really high level of skills in higher education, in engineering, in various sort of law and finance skills. So we have that highly skilled baseline. So it's a really, really good point for jumping into the opportunities of the transition. Now, the challenge for us, not just Aberdeen, but I think in many energy cities around the world, and this is something we're increasingly interested in the lab of collaborating with and exploring with partners, is how do you keep them here? Because if the oil industry declines here, and it is, many of those skilled workers will just leave. They might go to the Middle East, they might go to South America, they might go to the US. So how do we keep them here? And that is a real challenge. Now, some will stay, some might have embedded themselves and have families and stay. Some might switch to renewable jobs. The offshore wind industry here in the UK, as you're probably very aware, is booming. It is absolutely booming. It's slowed down a little bit of the last couple of years, but at least on policy terms, there are plans to have 50 gigawatts of offshore floating wind by 2030. We currently have about 12. So it's a quadrupling of offshore and floating wind. Just out my window here, as I look at the North Sea, there is Scottish government plans for 23 gigawatts of floating wind to be built out in the next 4 years. So that is a huge amount of opportunity there. But what we have found and what a lot of the discussions are about is that those renewable jobs don't pay as well as an engineer in oil and gas, doesn't get as much, about 20% less earnings in the renewable sector. So for some people, that will be too much and they'll leave, and we can't stop that. But for some people, there might be other factors here that keep them here. They might be invested. They might have a better quality of life, because we also tracked in our report the impact on families and individuals of, and this would be very familiar for you, the fly in, fly out type culture. And the social problems and the problems in families that's caused over generations. And we all have stories in Aberdeen about that, including my own family, where dad left and came back after 3 weeks and we didn't really know who he was, and those social problems that come with that. So there may be other factors. So it's not as simple as a decline in income, but we have a very, very strong skills base. And that is something we need to harness. But at presently, we actually lack a cohesive vision. We lack an industrial strategy for the region and actually for the country.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And that sort of ties me into sort of the next question that we got asked was, what role did companies play in the transition for workers in the community? So if we look at it in what roles they might play in the transition, were there indicators to measure their contribution? Are there any ways of looking at that?
Yeah, we do have indicators in the report of things such as company startups, company levels of innovation, and Aberdeen is still a very prosperous city. The oil and gas is declining over decades, but we really want to ensure that companies are center in this debate. In some ways, it's been too much focused on the oil and gas sector as a whole, and they've dominated discussions and decision making for decades. Aberdeen has been a one-horse town, but many of the other companies involved, such as the SME sector, has not been strongly involved in this. And there's a really interesting statistic here, produced by the Aberdeen Chamber of Commerce in its annual net zero survey, of that. I quote this all the time, and the chamber hate it when I quote it, but I'm quote it anyway. It's their own statistic that 1/3 of companies do not have a net zero strategy. Another third of companies have a net zero strategy with no criteria, dates, or timelines. And another third are preparing a net zero strategy. So in a city which prides itself as being the energy capital of Europe and wanting to be the net zero capital of Europe, 2/3 of the companies don't have a plan. And so this is bonkers, to be honest. It's crazy, right? So I think there's a real role here for organizations like the universities, that for policy to actually work with companies to bring them together to help build and maximize out their skills and build strategies for net zero. Again, it's underpinned. It's a very competitive town, Aberdeen. It's a town built on the influence of large scale private companies and the influence of markets in the life of the city and the workers. It's a part of who we are. Houston in Scotland isn't actually a bad reference for what life was like, at least historically, in Aberdeen. People say it's very much an American vibe, American city in Scotland. It's very different to Glasgow or Edinburgh, for example. And those who've been here can probably attest to that. But we have to get companies that are absolutely central to getting this transition right. Both energy companies changing and engaging, investing in the transition, SMEs getting on board because they will provide the employment, and bringing everyone together to form a much more cohesive vision rather than this bitty piecemeal competitiveness vision that we have. That's the challenge that we have to do over the next couple of years, and that we're working towards. And we have a lot of companies on board discussing this. We've got a very interesting just transitions dialogue group with BP, Shell, Total, Barclays, SSC, and the two local councils. It's taken us about 18 months just to get to know each other and trust each other on both sides and to have those conversations. And it's really, really interesting. For example, looking at how some of the energy majors can contribute to building better houses in the marginalized areas of Aberdeen, reinvesting in the community, having a stake in the community. So it is exciting, but there's a lot of work to be done.
Absolutely. If I move on from that, what about, from government policy points of view? Let's face it, UK's just had a major sea change in terms of shifting from the Conservative to Labour, and all that's likely to, sort of engender. Do you see that as being a way of trying to facilitate some of this change, this transition, or are there attention being focused? I think Scotland can be a bit Scotland-centric and London can be a bit London-centric.
What? I don't know what you're talking about.
No, of course you don't. But yeah, it's sort of the role of policymakers, particularly, sort of at the national level.
There's so much to talk about on this point. So I'll talk at the UK first. There's been a huge sea change in the UK government. I'll make no bones about it. Most of us are delighted with the result, I think, across the country. And there may have been some reflections in we're all familiar with the role of climate in Australian elections, right? And the challenges. Big promises are made, and then nothing much changes. The branding changes a little bit, but we're still exporting a whole stack of gas to Asia, despite the transitions in Australia. In the UK, it's very interesting. I've got my desk a newspaper from the start of this year. It's the local newspaper, the Press and Journal. The front page of it has got traitors across the top in massive writing, and it's got the current prime minister, but the leader of the opposition at the time, the energy minister, and a few other faces on the front, because the Labour policy was to stop a moratorium to stop oil exploration, and also to increase the windfall tax on oil and gas companies. They have, somewhat surprisingly, stuck to that promise. And there was a huge debate. And Aberdeen has never been so central to the British election. We could have been a suburb of Westminster. In fact, Aberdeen is often compared as a suburb of Westminster. It's very seen as been London's more focused on London and Scotland a lot of the time because of the nature of the city. And that was a huge policy debate. We had so many leaders flying into Aberdeen talking about the future of the North Sea, talking about the future of oil. You couldn't get two more different policy platforms, with the Conservative Party opening up more licenses, opening up more exploration, despite the fact it was over time, as the data shows us, it is a declining field and will continue to decline. In fact, the analysis by some of the climate science organizations, such as Carbon Trust, showed that In fact, even if all the new oil and gas fields were opened, it would only add 1 or 2% on top of the declining curve. So it really is the bottom of the barrel, and we're just adding little bits. Labour has been elected on a platform of stopping oil and gas exploration. It's still committing to doing that. The current discoveries will go through, will eventually be licensed, but there is no future exploration. Now, in physical terms, again, it's not much. It's 1 or 2% above a long-term decline. But in visual terms, and in policy terms, and in the message that sends out, it's a massive change. And there are huge debates about what that looks like. The other flip side to that offer from the Labor government is the creation of what's called GB Energy. A very imaginative title, Great British Energy, which will be a major new public energy company owned by the government. And that's going to be set up in the next 12 months to both own and invest in more riskier and community energy, and really upscale community energy systems. We want the Australian equivalent of solar rooftops for the UK. This could be local wind ownership plus solar, for example, and heat networks, and really increase that, and also sell energy to the public at a much more attractive and cheaper rate than what we've got from energy that's based off the cost of gas and skyrocketed and driven the inflation and the cost of living crisis in the UK. So that's exciting. There is a big debate where our bet is on that will be in Aberdeen. We'll be based in Aberdeen. They're not saying anything just yet. I've offered to be CEO, but I haven't got any response yet. So the offer's still there. But we're hoping it will come to Aberdeen, because that would send a message that the transition is happening. It will provide employment for many people. It would diversify the economy. We think those oil and gas skills can be redeployed to look at things such as retrofitting. It's impossible to get someone to do retrofitting in your house, whether it's energy efficiency, solar panels, heat networks. There's no one here doing that stuff. There's a huge opportunity waiting for that, and we think GB Energy could have a role. But we'll wait and see. There's a political battle behind the scenes. So it's very since July, there's been an optimism and a big change in there, but also a lot more policy consistency from the UK level. So that was critically important. In Scotland, different story, as you know. Scotland is devolved, so it's more like a state government. It has control over some aspects of energy policy, but sort of large-scale oil and gas strategic energy policy lies with the British government. But what Scotland has done, which is unique, is it did set up what's called the Just Transition Commission, an independent commission really focused on how to deliver a just transition across the board in Scotland. And it's set up, our work has fed in on measurement. It's set up a range of working groups around manufacturing, around energy, around agriculture, around communities, and it's held the government to account. And that's a policy mechanism I think is something is quite unique to Scotland and should be exported around the world. It's really focused, it's like an omnibusman or an independent environmental commissioner type role, focused solely on a just transition. So that's a really interesting development that we've been following and engaged with. I could speak all day on the politics, so I'll shut up now, as you can tell. So
yeah, no, it's a fascinating and a much more hopeful space. I'm going to move on. You sort of talked about what Scotland and what the UK could do, to another question, which is what other cities or regions have tried to measure progress towards just transitions? You mentioned Norway at the end. Have they attempted to do something similar? Or perhaps the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability. So what about taking it wider than Scotland and the UK?
Yeah, so we haven't done that yet, but that's our ambition. Our ambition is to partner with good people such as yourselves in WA, and we're very happy to have those discussions, because we're interested in energy cities and regions globally, because we think there are some similar characteristics and traits about how energy cities face the transition, whether it's in climate awareness in the populations, whether it's resistance or facilitation, or somewhere between the two, whether it's the skills base. So we think there are similar things and similar trends around the world in energy cities. On just transition in Norway, Norway doesn't have a commission on just transition. It's really avoiding the question, I think. Norway is incredibly wealthy. It's got the sovereign wealth fund. It's delivered from oil. It's not counted. It's not looking at the end of exploration of oil. It has substantial reserves growing for the future, whereas the North Sea reserves are substantially declining. It's kind of ignoring the question, to be honest. It wants to have a very clean, green society and yet be a major exporter of oil and gas. Sounds familiar, Australia, doesn't it, actually?
Mm.
Oh, yep, someone's just agreed with me. That's good. So Norway's not, but there are movements within Norway that are watching that there is an increased focus on politically about Norway with a future without oil, and some of the developments in say COP, such as the or that emerged from COP, such as the BOGAS agreement. So I always think it's Bogan agreement. It's a BOGAS agreement, the Beyond Oil and Gas global agreement, where they're trying to entice Norway in. Denmark's signed up to it. Ireland signed up to it. I think UK will probably sign up, is my bet. It wouldn't have 4 weeks ago. I think it will sign up to it, and this increasing pressure to join these movements. And that's not to say that oil and gas will be off a cliff edge. That's ridiculous. It's going to be 2 decades at least of oil and gas, the existing fields, used strategically and wisely. But we have to manage the decline away from manage a transition away from a declining system in the North Sea, in the UK. It's a different question for Australia. It's a very difficult question for you guys, because you think you're decarbonizing the domestic economy, but the growth in gas exports is huge. There, I've read a Guardian article that Australia has been described as a petro state now, which is probably not too far off it. So it's very challenging.
Yes. Yes.
But this is what the conference is about in November, and I'm really looking forward to come out and discuss those kind of questions as well.
That's we're looking forward to having you too. It'd be good to have you. I'm conscious of time. It's 5:28. I'm going to ask there's a question from David: who should fund a more just sustainability transition in Scotland, perhaps building on reparational justice approach? Should it be the oil and gas companies? So maybe we take that as the last question. And then I'll hand over to Elena just to make a comment about the next webinar. Actually, not a webinar, the next in-person presentation through the centre. So if you just want to answer that, Tavis, that would be great.
I think oil and gas companies absolutely have a role in funding this. I think we need to actually adjust some of our taxation and subsidy regimes to encourage just transitions. We see oil and gas companies globally, not just those here, but those representing globally, actually making massive profits. We've introduced in the UK a tax on the super profits of oil and gas companies. That was actually introduced by the Conservative government under immense public pressure, and has been going for a number of years. It's been fought tooth and nail by the oil and gas companies. Labor's policy was to expand that tax and increase that tax, which again they have done, and is very, very hostile here. But that money needs to go into supporting the growth in distributed renewable energies, community energy, infrastructure. We should have been doing this from day one in the history of the oil and gas industry, and we have a very different society out there, and maybe our local pool and local libraries wouldn't be closing. Massive profits and declining public infrastructure is the story, one of the stories from Aberdeen. So oil and gas has a role, but also we need to things like access pension funds. We need to access public and private partnerships and private investment and equity investment in just transition as well. So it's across the board, but oil and gas definitely have a role.
Great. Yes, and I think that's true. If you look at what's happened with Collie and the moving out of coal there should be more of a role. It's difficult when the companies though, and pushing borderline in terms of financial viabilities. We should do it at the front, not the back. Anyway,
Yep.
can I thank you so much, Tavis, for what's been a really, really great and interesting presentation. You know, I've been
Thank
looking
you.
at some of the comments and I'm by no means alone. Elena, do you want to just give a very quick update in terms of the next session that's being hosted by the Centre?
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming along. If you're in Perth, we're hosting an in-person seminar with Sharon Burrow, who's the former General Secretary of the largest trade union in the world. She'll be doing a really fantastic talk on net zero, sustainable business and labour rights. We're also sorting out a live stream if you're not based in Perth, but if you are based in Perth, there'll be networking drinks as well. So if you come along on the 12th of August, we'd love to see you there.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody, and really nice to speak to home as well. Always good to see some trees